Welcome. This is James Corbett of the Corbett Report with your EyeOpener report for BoilingFrogsPost.com. Until last Saturday, those who called former Vice President Dick Cheney heartless would have been more or less technically correct. Since 2010, the now 71-year-old with a history of heart troubles has been using a HeartMate II, a left ventricle assistance device that helped his heart to pump blood to its organs. Unlike other technologies that seek to emulate the beating of the heart, the HeartMate uses a pump to create a continuous flow of blood through the circulatory system, meaning that patients, including Dick Cheney, have no pulse while using the device. For someone who has long been likened to Darth Vader for his increasingly improbable medical longevity and his penchant for projecting an aura of evil and unconcern, the talking heads on both the left and right of the controlled political paradigm seem to have gone out of their way to avoid raising any of the issues surrounding the former vice president or his time in office in their coverage of the incident.
Dick Cheney has, of course, said and done many things with which many people have taken angry issue, myself included. But Dick Cheney is also a husband and a father and an American who has spent most of his life in public service, and we wish him a full and speedy recovery. Sincerely.
What such gentle coverage obscures is that far from a respected and respectable public servant with whom some people on the other side of the aisle had some trifling political disagreements, Dick Cheney is in fact one of the world's most reviled, unindicted war criminals, a man who has consistently demonstrated a contempt for the electorate who put him into office, who has helped to engineer the current Department of Fatherland security paradigm, who has paved the way for the rise of Blackwater and the privatization of the military, who has spearheaded the use of torture techniques as an acceptable practice by U.S. forces, and who led the U.S. into 2 separate illegal wars of aggression based on lies. The Dick Cheney story started in January 1941, when Richard Bruce Cheney was born in Lincoln, Nebraska. Raised in Wyoming and a captain of his high school football team, Dick Cheney's life of privilege got off to an early start when a family friend pulled some strings to get him into Yale. A lackluster and uninterested student, he managed to flunk out twice, then got arrested for drunk driving. When the country became embroiled in the Vietnam War, Cheney managed to dodge the draft every single year that he was eligible.
In 1963, with thousands of GIs already in Southeast Asia, Cheney went back to college and got another student deferment. In 1964, when Congress approved unlimited force in Vietnam, that student deferment was renewed, and he wed his high school sweetheart, Lynn. In 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson doubled the number of draftees, Cheney graduated. He should have been prime draft bait, but he wasn't, because he was now a married man. When the U.S. announced it would start drafting married men without children, call it good luck or good timing, but 9 months and 2 days later, the Cheney's first child was born. Cheney was rewarded with a 5th and final exemption from military service. At last, on his 26th birthday, he could relax. He was officially too old to be drafted.
Cheney's first project as a Republican congressional aide was to write a law that would allow the government to punish colleges that allowed anti-war protests. He soon managed to team up with Donald Rumsfeld, who brought him into the White House in the 1970s as Ford's deputy chief of staff. Even after leaving the White House and becoming a congressman, Cheney was still at the heart of the American political apparatus. His regard for the voting public during his time as an elected official was perhaps best summed up during some candid remarks at the end of his career at a meeting of the Council on Foreign Relations, a group whose directorship he kept hidden from his constituency during his years in Washington.
It's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
During the 1980s, while he served as a congressman and Rumsfeld helped G.D. Searle & Co. win FDA approval for aspartame for continuity of government operations. Under a cover of secrecy so complete that even their wives were not told where they were going, 40 to 60 federal officials flew to a remote, undisclosed location to create procedures for the government to implement in the case of a national emergency. It was in these meetings that Rumsfeld, Cheney, and others drew up the plans for the very continuity of government protocols that would be implemented just over a decade later, on September 11, 2001, while Rumsfeld sat in the Pentagon and Cheney coordinated the response from a bunker under the White House. Cheney was back at the heart of the administration during the George H.W. Bush presidency when he served as defense secretary during the First Gulf War. At the time, Cheney's Pentagon claimed to have top-secret satellite photos showing that the Iraqis had amassed 250,000 troops and 1,500 tanks on the border of Saudi Arabia, presumably readying for an invasion. That, however, was a complete lie.
We've obtained copies of those Soviet satellite photos from September 1990. With powerful magnification, the photographs are detailed enough for experts to identify vehicles around the Kuwaiti oil fields. But in southern Kuwait, along the Saudi border, there are no Iraqi tanks to be seen whatsoever, let alone 1,500 of them. Just sand and wind. Not a sign of what Defense Secretary Cheney insisted were 250,000 Iraqi troops.
Perhaps one of his most important acts during his tenure as Secretary of Defense came after the Gulf War was over. Under the pretense of downsizing the American military to implement George H.W. Bush's post-Soviet New World Order, Cheney's Pentagon awarded a contract to KBR, a Halliburton subsidiary, to investigate the possibility of contracting out military services to private companies. Unsurprisingly, KBR concluded this would be a good thing, and soon Halliburton and other private companies were receiving a larger and larger slice of the Washington defense budget pie. Also unsurprisingly, Cheney left his post as defense secretary at the end of the Bush administration and became CEO of Halliburton. During this time, Cheney was asked about whether or not the U.S. erred by not invading Baghdad during the First Gulf War.
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place?
Sadly, from the moment that the second Bush administration was in office, with Dick Cheney in the VP office and longtime cohort Rumsfeld in charge of the Pentagon, creating that very quagmire in Iraq was at the top of Cheney's to-do list.
Accusations from a Bush cabinet insider, former Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, who was saying, among other things, that Mr. Bush was determined to get Saddam Hussein from his first day in office. ABC's John Cochran reports.
Paul O'Neill says at Mr. Bush's first National Security Council meeting, O'Neill was surprised to find that getting Hussein was now the administration's focus. That much was already clear.
By now, the story of how Cheney and his friends in the Bush administration lied the American people into an illegal war of aggression, the supreme war crime as established by the Nuremberg trials, is all too familiar.
Cheney had this little hideaway office in the Capitol, room H208, and he invited Army one day to come in there. And he said, I'm going to give you a special briefing. This is the really sensitive stuff. We haven't talked about it before. We don't want to alarm the public. It's worse than we say. And he tells him two things. He tells him Saddam Hussein has direct personal family ties to al-Qaeda. And he tells him that Iraq is well on its way to developing miniature nuclear weapons. So the scenario is suitcase nuke, good pal of al-Qaeda, who knows what'll happen, but it's bad. And Army told me that he just could not, he could not maintain his opposition in the face of that. Now, I know from a lot of heavy reporting on this that this is not like the stuff that Cheney was saying in public where, you know, did he exaggerate? Did he rely on unreliable evidence? Did he cherry pick? This is just flat out. There's just no evidence for it. It's made up. And Cheney knew that Army's vote was absolutely pivotal. And Army has held his silence all these years, but he's a very angry man about this, and he said that he believes Cheney lied to him, and he knowingly. And he also used words that you can't put in the family newspaper.
All too familiar, too, is Cheney's role in overseeing the illegal torture techniques, including waterboarding, authorized under his watch to wage the so-called War on Terror.
Did you authorize the tactics that were used against Khalid Sheikh Mohammed?
I was aware of the program, certainly, and involved in helping get the process cleared. That is, the agency, in effect, came in and wanted to know what they could and couldn't do. And they talked to me as well as others to explain what they wanted to do, and I supported it.
In hindsight, do you think any of those tactics that were used against Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and others went too far?
I don't.
And on KSM, one of those tactics, of course, widely reported was waterboarding, and that seems to be a tactic we no longer use. Even that, you think, was appropriate?
I do.
Given all of the evidence amassed against Dick Cheney, the evidence that paints a clear and unambiguous picture of the former vice president's repeated acts of greed, abuse of power, violation of the public trust, and criminal activities up to and including crimes against humanity, the so-called mainstream media's willingness to begin papering over this history in favor of the TV-friendly soft sell of Cheney as a hard-working, but perhaps misguided servant of the public trust is utterly damning, if not surprising. No, the revolution will not be televised, which is precisely why no one listens to the MSM talking heads or the endless echo chamber of the Beltway insiders who live only for the preservation of the illusion that their system is fundamentally sound. Instead, the people are making their voices heard in ways that the establishment media would never dare to broadcast, exactly as happened during Dick Cheney's speaking engagement in Vancouver, British Columbia last year.
Don't you think that buying tickets to this event is aiding and abetting a war criminal? Does that not make sense to you?
Are you aiding and abetting a war criminal by going in?
You don't think so? You disagree with that? You don't think that that's aiding and abetting? Are you having fun now? You don't think that that is aiding and... I'm asking you a serious question, and you can't answer.
The door's over here, sir. The door's over here. Torture, hey buds, torture! Torture! Torture!
Perhaps it is too late for Cheney ever to be brought to justice. Given his long-standing record of serious medical problems and the high-risk nature of the heart transplant he has just received, it is unlikely that he would survive long enough to be brought to trial and found guilty of his crimes against humanity. But perhaps there is a certain form of justice in the people standing up to these war criminals and would-be tyrants, reminding them that the power is in the hands of the people and that no matter how powerful the so-called political elite believe themselves to be, they only ever govern with at least the tacit support of the public. And once that support is taken away and the people find their voice, these self-proclaimed elites suddenly find the world they presume to run becoming noticeably smaller. Just ask Bush why he wouldn't fly to Switzerland to deliver his speech last year, or why Henry Kissinger flies around the world in constant fear of his flight being diverted to Paris. Still though, the outrage over the unspeakable atrocities committed by and on behalf of these unindicted war criminals leaves many with a bitter taste in their mouth. How can it be that people like these die comfortably in their beds of natural causes, while untold millions have been slaughtered, their lives, families, and homes ripped apart as a direct result of the calculated lies that feed the American war machine? It may be naive, but there is still the chance for some measure of justice in this situation. One can only hope that Dick Cheney's literal change of heart will bring with it a figurative one, and that we may still have time to witness Cheney's repentance and atonement for his past conduct. After all, strange things have been known to take place in patients after a heart transplant.
Only time will tell for Dick Cheney, and with his new heart, perhaps a new character trait is upon him. For Darrell Williams, that is no joke, and when a nurse asked him if anything felt different or not like himself after his transplant, he answered,
"You know, it is one thing that I think about. There's this laugh that I have now that I never had before. I don't know where it comes from, you know? I mean, I laugh, my normal laugh, but then this other piece comes out that I can't identify from anybody." And so she said, "Yeah, we've had people say things like that before, you know." Well.
This video is brought to you by the subscribers of BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information on this and other topics, please go to BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information and commentary from James Corbett, please go to corbettreport.com.